Gracious and loving God, you have created the world and you have rested. You have set that model. You have given us that gift. And so we ask your forgiveness for the times that we choose an alternative, that we prefer to be in the rat race than to accept your gift. We ask that you be with us today, that you open our eyes to ways that we might observe your Sabbath and the ways we might honor it in ways that glorify you. We ask this prayer in the name of your risen Son. So, as I said, we had 2 weeks on the Sabbath, and I will go ahead and put my PowerPoint up here. And we're going to be looking at the Sabbath from 2 different perspectives. The command to observe Sabbath is actually lots of places in Scripture. It's lots of places in Scripture, but we're going to look at 2 passages in particular that vary from each other because they view the commandment to do the commandment for different reasons. So we're going to look at those, and basically we're going to be looking at the Sabbath as resistance and as peace is sort of a general term. This week we'll look at Sabbath as resistance. We're going to look at a passage from Deuteronomy. I've been using 3 books this week. Walter Brueggemann has this book, Sabbath as Resistance. And then some of you have read Barbara Brown Taylor's Altar in the World, and she has a great chapter on the practice of saying no. Next week, we'll talk about Sabbath as more as rest, but Abraham Heschel, who's a rabbi who died in the 70s, wrote this book, The Sabbath, and he introduces us to a broader concept of Sabbath. So we'll look at these 2 different things. They seem to be opposites, and what we're going to do is find a way to kind of hold those together as a way of understanding a bigger picture of Sabbath. I think traditionally we observe Sabbath as a time in which we don't do things. It's a time of abstaining, but there's this really bigger picture that we're called into in terms of practicing Sabbath. So we're not going to talk about what we're not going to do on Sundays. More, we're going to talk about how we are existing, we're living in the space of Sabbath. So that's kind of how we'll go about it. What I'm hoping that we'll come away with at the end of 2 weeks is one, this bigger understanding of Sabbath, but our own personal understanding of Sabbath, and maybe some ways that we might practice it, as well as how our practice of Sabbath impacts other people. I think we tend to think about it as something we did personally, but there is a communal aspect to it as well. So we'll walk through that today. In order to get us into this, I'd like to sort of tell the story of the Israelites, and you all know the story, so I'm going to call on y'all to fill it in. But just to bring us up to the place where we're going to look at 2 passages. God called a man out of his country into a land that he promised, and the man was Abram. Later Abraham, who he said, your descendants will be as numerous as stars, numerous as grains of the sand. And so his family grows, and they end up in famine in the land. So they go to Egypt, where they encounter a long lost brother, Joseph. And there they live for a long time. They're there. Joseph has found favor with Pharaoh, and so they live in relative peace. But that's how we end the book of Genesis. We turn the page and we see, and a new Pharaoh arose that did not know Joseph. So Pharaoh then sees that this growing family is very numerous and begins to be threatened by it. And so Pharaoh enslaves the people, conscripts them into labor on his behalf. And that's where we see Moses kill someone, run to the wilderness, and encounter the burning bush. And the burning bush, what does God ask him to do from the burning bush?
Go back to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let my people go.
Let my people go. Yeah. So he goes back. We get 10 plagues. We get Passover, which the Jewish population has just celebrated. And then they go out. They approach the Red Sea. Pharaoh's army is encroaching on them, and they, what are we to do? And God does this miraculous thing. What does he do? Parts the Red Sea. And they go across in safety to the other side, and scripture tells us that the Pharaoh and his army and his chariots and his horses are all engulfed in the water. So they're in the Sinai Peninsula at this point, and they walk towards Mount Sinai, where God's presence has come to rest on the top of the mountain. And I'm skipping over a lot, obviously. Moses goes up and he gets a series of commandments that will help shape this family into a people. It's a massive group, so shape them into a people. Gives them lots of commandments. Among them are the 10 Commandments, which we know well, the commandment to build the tabernacle and so forth. So fast forward about 41 years, they're still in the desert and the wilderness. And as they're approaching the promised land, they're just on the other side. Moses gives this long sermon in the book of Deuteronomy. It's all about remembering. Remember when, remember, don't forget, remember. And so that's where we encounter the second reiteration of the 10 Commandments. So with me.
You want to hit your
Oh, yes, thank you. Yes, Claire has read all these books. So Claire, welcome. We've just done several thousand years of history of the Israelites in about 3 minutes. So we've come to this first passage, and these are the two passages we're going to look at by comparison. And the first one is the one that we know from Exodus. This is the 10 Commandments, and it says, "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son, your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it." So we have a reference to the creation story here. In Deuteronomy, when this same command is given, it's a bit longer. Shrink this up. We see, "Observe the Sabbath day, keep it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male or female slave or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock, or the resident alien in your town, so that your male and female slave may rest as well as you. Remember," this is Moses' favorite word here, "remember you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." So immediately we see this difference between these two is in this final, and there are a few other differences, but this final, the reason why God is commanding Sabbath. So we're going to look at this Deuteronomy passage this week. So in a minute, I'm going to stop talking and let you all talk, but just to frame it again, this memory, we've talked about what their memory was, the memory of the Israelites of this land being called out of Egypt, being rescued, in this redemption from slavery. So we begin in Exodus with this, "Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph." And so I've excerpted the story, and this is in Exodus 1 and 5. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." They set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor, such as building cities for Pharaoh. The Egyptians became ruthless in their imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter. Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters of the people, "You shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks. Go now and work, for no straw shall be given you, but you shall still deliver the same number of bricks. Complete your work, the same daily assignments when you're given straw. You shall not lessen your daily number of bricks." So just paint a picture of this system of oppression that Pharaoh is imposing? Who benefits? What's the system?
Exploitation. They said they worked on Pharaoh's projects, so I guess Pharaoh was the primary beneficiary.
Beneficiary. And I've read some, it may have actually been in scripture. Again, I just cut out a lot for speed, but there were storehouses. There were places for his wealth. They were, it might have been pyramids where his kin would go, or wealth in different cities. So clearly taking care of Pharaoh and Pharaoh's system. And in that first slide or two, what was his reasoning for deciding to enslave the Israelites?
Too numerous, and that's the war against us.
Yeah.
Just way our family.
Right. So it was power, very much so. So as we see this Pharaoh, and part of what Moses is doing, I think, in this remember, is he's setting up this, this Pharaoh who's a god of work. I mean, he thinks he's a god, but he's a ruler of work, of oppression, of inhumanity, and he's setting up God as something different. God's an alternative. So what does this sound like in our world today?
But when we were talking about Pharaoh, the first thing that came to my mind was Vladimir Putin
Okay.
as an oppressor.
Yeah.
But I think it could be also systems.
Mm-hmm. So give an example.
Well, as far as the system of government, a government that imposes unequal or unjust burdens on some people to the benefit of other people.
Okay. Well put, very succinctly, but yeah, that's certainly what Pharaoh is doing. But we see that in our world today. And in our, think about it, in our country, I think Putin is a good example of one that is very power driven. I mean, I think Pharaoh and Putin, that's a really a good parallel there. But when we think about our country in the systems, a lot of them are economic. It's wealth driven. It's it's power driven to be sure, but it's wealth driven. And so our pharaohs then become the systems that maintain whatever it does to maintain the level of economic beneficiary level that we are trying to promote. So when we think about our pharaohs, and another thing to think about is as we read in those short clips, the taskmasters were the ones who were actually in charge of making the Israelites make wool bricks. They were asking them to work harder, paying them the same thing, no doubt. I mean, I'm sure they did not get raises. They had fewer resources. They were still being asked to do more with less. One of the things that comes to my mind is the teachers who are working in school systems with fewer resources, but still asked to do the same thing. So when we think about not just humans, but maybe systems, maybe influences, what are today's taskmasters that perpetuate this idea that always a greater effort is required? So what in our culture today is asking this?
I think in every culture in the world, because of globalism, people are being asked to work harder. regardless of what country it is, if it makes a product that competes in the world, people that produce the product are asked to work harder. And wages are kept at lower levels in order to produce a price that can compete on the world market. From Vietnam, China, Taiwan, all over Southeast Asia, now in Africa, parts of South America, Latin America. As bad as it is here, it's worse there.
Yeah. Well, and we lean in this country, which I think is what we're implying, we lean heavily on those countries, on labor from those countries. That is less than we would pay someone here to the exploitation of those people.
It's a rock and a hard place.
I think the difficulty with this question is I keep going back to Pharaoh and the Israelites, because that was, it was forced labor based on a caste system, based on an ethnicity. So we follow that through, and then I start thinking about systemic racism. Then it gets much more thorny than just talking about the economics of poor countries and wealthy countries like ours, because many times there is an ethnic or racial component as to how or why we're able to keep people economically beneath us, or
I don't think people set out to keep people economically below. I just don't know. I don't think they sit in the corner office and say, oh, how do we keep those people miserable and way down there? I think they say, how do we make a product less expensive?
Or
And
how do I
that
get,
the result is,
it's
I don't think it's a conscious decision to oppress
got a chat here.
I
Yeah,
think if some people knew what the working conditions were in some other countries where we pursue products that have a very, very low labor component, knew what it was, we wouldn't buy it.
so John is asking everybody who's talking to speak up. I tried to move the owl closer to me. It's got about an 18-foot range, so if you're at the back, speak up.
Sorry.
Thank you, John, for sharing that. Yeah, I think you make a good point that it is the result of wanting to keep myself at the top, that others end up at the bottom. And we hope that no one is intentionally keeping people at the bottom. But if we look to Selena's point, if we look back 400 years, there was absolutely a choice of bringing people to our country. They looked a certain way. We created a system that defined their color as inferior. I mean, it was an absolute intentional system of subjugating, of oppressing of people 400 years ago in slavery. And so I think we end up, we as we know, and we've talked about a lot, is that we end up still living out some of those patterns. It's hard for people to escape some of those patterns.
It's not to speak specifically to the Sabbath.
Well, good question. Good question. We're getting there. One thing I do want to, just a couple of things on this last question, just thoughts about how we are exploiting our systems. Just a couple is that we have this marketing and advertising engine that over and over and over tells us we need something bigger, better, shinier, brighter, faster, whatever. So we have that all the time. Another example that just came to my mind is the competitiveness of college admissions. We're asking our kids to be smart, compassionate, well-rounded, angular, all these things, and just been driving the demand for this ideal, this high achieving thing. And finally, we're exploiting our land so that we get the reddest strawberries, or we get the most hamburger that we can. So we exploit our systems, our children, everybody, in order to get more and more and more. So
That's sort of the nature of capitalism, right? That's basic. Right? Unless it's restrained by laws that prohibit exploitation of labor or land or resources. But untethered, whatever, my job as a capitalist is to maximize profits.
Right.
Period.
Right, and I
Within
think,
moral grounds and legal, moral bounds.
yes, yeah, I was gonna say untethered, I think is the key there, because absent those boundaries, that's true. So we've become accustomed to this sort of a mentality of more, which is, I think I have a slide here a little later. Let's see, chat.
Too much is not enough.
Can you all read that? John said, little concern for the common good, short-term focus on just about everything. Okay. So to Bill's point about Sabbath, good question. That's the topic of our class today. Brueggemann builds this model in his book that we are in a system of more bricks. And so he says that Sabbath is a call to resist that system. He uses the phrase, Sabbath is resistance because it is a visible insistence that our lives are not defined by the production and consumption of commodity goods. So he's asking us to exercise a different perspective, a different way of, he's asking us, I think, Bill, to your point, to put boundaries on capitalism.
Yes, so we remember blue laws, so
Yeah.
the stores were open. So the government somehow had decided that, we are going to honor the Sabbath by not having the stores open so you can focus on different things. But despite the fact, and eventually eroded, I guess, because all those blue laws went away.
Yeah.
To basically commerce, 7 days a week.
Into secularism also.
So did you all practice Sabbath, or were your families practicing Sabbath when you were growing up?
It strikes me that what Brueggemann is saying here is that Sabbath was created for the benefit of people, to give everybody a day of rest. And that by violating the Sabbath, you take away rights that people should have that are for their benefit. And so to me, it's kind of like not having a minimum wage that even if you work a full work week, you can't earn enough money to live.
Yeah.
To me, it's a similar kind of thing. You're taking away something that's fundamental to somebody's health.
But there were a lot of opponents that were doing away with blue laws who said that the poor work so hard during the week they cannot get it all done on Saturdays. They need an opportunity to do the necessities. I'm good both sides of that argument. I'm really disappointed the Sabbath isn't the way it was in terms of everything closed. But when they were discussing, debating whether or not stores, that was one of the arguments that got advanced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing is, I think at least my family's interpretation of Sabbath was a bunch of, you can't do this. You cannot do homework on Sunday. You cannot go do this or that. It was all negative as opposed to a day of recreation.
Right.
That would have been a good excuse on Monday morning in class. I never thought of that. I'm sorry, I can't do it.
Oh, no, that just meant it had to be done Saturday and Friday.
Yeah, it puts a lot into Saturday, for sure, that you have to do if you're preparing for the Sabbath. And remember that in Jewish time, Jewish culture, time historically, the Sabbath begins at sundown. So on Friday night, it stops. So it's technically, I guess you could do it from sundown until Monday morning. You could do your homework. But, yeah. But like I said, he is saying, he is asking us to step out of that culture of more for the reasons you're saying. I think you said it really well, Hal. He also offers it as an alternative, which is a very, for me, is a very welcome thought. And he says, Sabbath as an alternative to the endless demands of economic reality that leave us endlessly restless inadequate, unfulfilled, and in pursuit of that which may satiate desire. So we're in this rat race kind of culture of always trying to satisfy some desire. And he's saying that Sabbath invites us into this place. And I mean, to put it back in our context for this week, in the passage that we read, he's saying, just because you remember what it's like to be oppressed and be a slave, therefore you should observe the Sabbath, keep it holy. Any thoughts from our Zoom participants on what we're talking about?
Gerald. Gerald, when I was growing up, I don't remember a lot about what you don't do because the day was so filled with what you do. So it was Sunday school and church, Sunday dinner with grandparents, home for a nap, and then to see other grandparents. And it was kind of a crisis when we were old enough for youth group, because that was a fracture in what had been family day. Not go play with friends on Sunday. It was just a family day. Church and family visiting, maybe the great aunt or whatever. So
That is, I feel like,
And-
happy.
Yeah, I do remember Dad saying that we didn't go shopping or go out to eat, well, except occasionally, because that made other people be forced to work.
Yeah, and that's where we're going from here, because, and Claire is in Tuesday Bible study. I told them that we're doing Heschel, and that was one of the things that came to me because Claire mentioned it. Let me, before I skip there, thank you for that, Claire. I wanted this phrase that I love from Walter Brueggemann, that we live in this liturgy of scarcity when we are being called into, a liturgy of scarcity when we are being called into a lyric of abundance. And we do a whole nother class on the manna that they received, that abundance, and there was just enough, and there was, but we're not in that class. So to your point, Claire, and thank you for launching us into that, who is most burdened by the economic systems of our time that require more bricks? We sort of touched on this, but let's sort of name it for what it is. If we want to, well, I'll quote some Barbara Brown Taylor said, is that on Mondays when the blue laws went away, it was there was somebody needed to work, and the high wage earners said, no thanks, I'd rather go play golf, which left it to the low wage earners to do work on Sundays, so that the higher wage people could do what they wanted to do or could do their shopping. So that's part of it. But I'm interested if there are other sort of reflections, how you mentioned it. John.
What is it that has driven us to always want more? When I go back and think of when I was 60 years ago, I look at the house I grew up in, and I look what was classified as necessities. The list of necessities is 10 times longer today than it was 60 years ago. We have talked ourselves into having to have 4 televisions, 6 televisions, multiple iPhones, all sorts of electronic equipment, all that. So we talked about, gotta have it.
Right.
Where'd that come from? And what can we do about it?
Great question, and I'll throw that out to the group.
So I thought it was interesting during COVID, I had given my car to my son, and he was in Durham, so Rick and I went a whole year with only one car. And it was absolutely fine. The whole year with just one car. You know, because when you said that, I thought about cars. You know, how people need more cars now.
Yeah.
It was pleasant.
Yeah.
You work around it. Happy to have the one. That's right.
I'd say the people most burdened are all the places in our society where there's tremendous stress for the demands, especially of your employer. And that can be anywhere from people at the very top of all the way to the very bottom. And it just, some of it depends on the culture within the companies, and it happens in schools, as you mentioned too. People just feeling stressed out, that more is demanded of them than they feel like they can do, and a lot of that is pressed by the companies, feeling that the economic system is saying, well, okay, we can eliminate this person and have these other people take up their job, you know, try to make it balanced.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, that it's not just the low wage earners. It's those who are, one of the chapters in Brueggemann's book is anxiety. It's a response to anxiety, kind of how he phrases it, but wherever resistance to anxiety, wherever there is stress in the system to create what John talked about, those are people are bearing the burden.
Yeah, but in theory, anyway, the most burden would be, listen, for those in the bottom of the economic pyramid, it's less voluntary in theory for them. I work many Sundays voluntarily. Rather, I wasn't, but it was totally, I felt stressed to do it.
Yeah.
But it was totally voluntary, whereas maybe if I were just the bottom of the economic system, you know, I gotta work.
Yeah.
I'm grateful to have this job just to make ends meet.
Yeah. And there's both the, I need the job to make ends meet, but also you don't show up on your job and you lose your job.
Right.
I thought about that also during that is oppression, and during COVID, that there are people who had to show up at their jobs because they would lose their jobs if they didn't have, and we needed them to be working in the drugstores and the grocery stores and so forth. So you all make great points, and to John's point, you know, the question becomes, why have we become habituated to this system of more? I mean, what is it? Is it the pharaohs who are setting examples? Is it the advertising and marketing systems?
So human weakness.
Weakness.
Human weakness.
Human weakness. Okay, John.
I think it's the worship of money.
Okay.
That's why
When I was working 30-something years ago, building a building in Georgia for a company, and I happened to be in Atlanta for Sunday, and the newspaper on Sunday, the Atlanta newspaper had an article on Atlanta's brightest and best. It was a fascinating article, and it was a preacher, it was an educator, it was a philanthropist, a writer, historian, scientist, breadth, and every race, creed, and color and socioeconomic was in these 20 people that they got highlighted. I got on the airplane and went home, and I drove from the airport to the house, and my wife had out the Dallas Morning News Sunday edition. And lo and behold, there was an article in the Dallas Morning News about Dallas's brightest and best. The exact same headline. What was it? It was the 20 best dressed people in Dallas. And I'm telling you, it was indicative of people spending lots and lots of money for appearances. Whereas the people that were highlighted in Atlanta, for the most part, were people that did not care about how they looked. They cared about the contributions that they made. It was about giving. The other was about taking. And it's just a cultural difference that has evolved in my lifetime.
It's alternatives. It's what you choose, the alternative that you choose. This was a line in Brueggemann's book. To serve God and wealth at the same time is impossible. It is like keeping Sabbath and at the same time planning for commerce. It's like making deep love, but all the while watching the clock. It's like praising Jesus while praying on the board. Such multitasking with a divided heart means that there's no real work stoppage, no interruption of frantic attempt to get ahead. That's all. That didn't fit in necessarily. Okay, so we've talked about this. You know, who is, yes, Claire.
Well, so this, in my mind, is part of it. And at the risk of stepping of being controversial, I have a hard time with this because there are so many people who literally have to work 6 or 7 days in order to have enough to eat and to care for their children. So some of the done that requires more bricks is pay people such a low wage so we get more than they have to work these days. So
Yes, that is an excellent way. Living wage is an important thing, and I think that's part of what you were getting at now. So I think we're beginning to see this question is how our choices of Sabbath impact others. And Barbara Brown Taylor had a great quote that by interrupting our economically sanctioned social order every week, Sabbath practice suspends our subtle and not so subtle ways of dominating one another on a regular basis. And admittedly, mine and Claire has shared the great story that she had, and I hope you don't mind me sharing this, Claire, that she doesn't go to Harris Teeter on Sundays. It's something that she adopted last year. Claire's doing that, mine doing that, doesn't mean that Harris Teeter employee won't have to work, but it is a symbolic and a movement towards something else. And it's an understanding and a practice of Sabbath.
Everybody did it, then Harris Teeter wouldn't be open. So
Right.
everybody did it.
Right, if people start going.
Well, another way to look at it is to say, okay, everybody's Sabbath doesn't have to be literally the same day.
that's
So-
correct.
Yeah.
So like paying a living wage, you can say everybody gets a day. It could be Monday for some people, or Friday if they're Muslim, or Saturday if they're Jewish.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, there's also, there's a little wrench in the works here. And like, back out in the year 2000, I was on rounds one Saturday morning, and I bumped into a pulmonary specialist who was an Orthodox Jew, yarmulke wearing. And I seen him walking from his home in Foxcroft to the Lubavitch Center and back on Saturday. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he's still walking home from services. And Joe Lieberman was running for vice president at that time, and people were saying, well, he can't be vice president. Well, what's he going to do on Saturdays? He can't get in the car. He can't do this. He can't do that. And I asked Selwyn, his name. I asked, what is the deal here? He said, well, the fact is, if what you're doing is to save a life, then you may work on Sabbath. That's why I can be here doing this. I can get my car and drive here to do this. He said, and so they say that anything the president's doing, or vice president's doing, is to save a life, though he would do it on Saturday. But in such a way, these people at Harris Teeter are providing food to save lives and also to provide for their own families. I mean,
yeah,
this is the kind of question that Barbara Tito would have a field day with.
Well, we taught this. I taught a week, and then several years ago, about 7 or 8 years ago, in the Bob Barber class then, and Barbara taught a week, which was great to hear from her. So thank you, Scott. I mean, that's a good observation from the Jewish standpoint, but I think it's a cultural observation, but I think we can also incorporate it. So living wage critical to solving housing. Okay. Well, you get ready to say something else, Scott. Okay. So Thank you for that. I think that's an important part. And I think to Hal's point, the solution might be everybody gets a day off, everybody gets a living wage. One of the things that Sabbath does is it equalizes us. It gives us the opportunity to be on equal footing. As part of that verse that we read, 6 days show that you labor, your slave, your ox, your donkey, so that your male and female slave may rest as well as you. That's part of the commandment that's in that Deuteronomy passage. It's not that they can have their kind of rest, they just don't work as hard on that. They work, but not as hard. It's so they can rest like you. So it's intended to equalize us in terms of observance of Sabbath, of this rest and renewal time. Barbara Brown Taylor says, when the Walmart cashier and the bank president are both lying on a picnic cloth in the park, you can't tell them apart. So we participate in Sabbath again as that equalizer. It's a matter of trust. We talked about the culture of want, of more, and we, this is again Brueggemann, he says we live by gift and not by possession, that we are satisfied by relationships of attentive fidelity, that's one of his big words, and not by amassing commodities, that we, when we live into this kind of Sabbath that Deuteronomy is commanding us, we are satisfied with what we have, and so we don't stretch for more, we don't, we can live into this rest and renewal. And then finally, Sabbath as rest, it's hard for us because we live at this brick making speed. And God is offering us this alternative to this anxiety producing system. So we're called into that. The other thing that I thought was helpful is to think of ourselves when I read that passage about multitasking, and when we are multitasking, we are thinking about commerce on the Sabbath, we're divided, and God is calling us to be all for God. And this Sabbath day is that day in which we are present with and in the space of God. And Abraham Heschel will talk next week about being in God's time. So we're not divided. And then this quote, I didn't mean to put it twice, but we as a society, we're less divided if we live into this Sabbath way of being. So it's a neighborly reality. So, so the other thing I just wanted to say is that Sabbath is this opportunity, and we'll get into this more next week, but Sabbath is an opportunity to live into what God envisions for us, to live into that space in a way that we participate in it, and it becomes habitual. We practice it over and over, all the commandment to live and to rest and to allow others to rest. So I think that's one of the things that Sabbath does, is it allows us to step in, to use a more of a New Testament phrase, to step into the kingdom. So thoughts, I've just rattled off a bunch of quotes at you. What are your thoughts as we wrap up this conversation?
Well, just that it would be important, John, this is Dan, to fill your Sabbath with something meaningful rather than thinking, well, and it could be for like working in the yard, it wouldn't have to be, but you should be thoughtful about what you fill it with, I would think. And I was sure we'll talk about that next week.
Yeah. Well, and next week, it is more existential. I mean, this is more concrete, and next week we'll get it's a little more existential, a way of being at God's time.
Because, just being intentional about what you do, I think. Would be.
Yeah.
And DeClaire's point, this is how DeClaire's point about using Sunday as a time to maintain relationships and build family.
Yeah.
For a lot of people, Sunday is the most important day of the week between September and December, because it's professional football, so it's going to be an editorial contest.
Very expensively, highly paid players giving each other concussions.
Yeah.
Certainly not worth the sake of.
Gerald,
True. Yes.
one of the books that I read about the Sabbath gave examples which I had not considered, such as it's what I think allows you to be really rested and recreated. So maybe it's taking a walk, especially in a beautiful place, or even going to a museum. I mean, it doesn't mean in this particular author's description, it is filling the day, as Nan just said, in a meaningful way. And that's different for different people. But again, it is I love the Jewish tradition of welcoming the Sabbath as a day that is different and enjoying it as God gave the example in creation. It's hard to do. I'm not there. I like the idea.
Well, I think thank you, Claire. Yeah, when Claire mentioned in Bible study, one of the things was taking that day to visit people who need your care. So yes, I agree. It's very hard. We're set at brick making speed, but we are we're called to practice it, and we're called to practice it every 7 days. And one of the footnotes in Heschel's book says that there are no 7 days without Sabbath, which is a very welcome thought in my mind. So we'll never go 7 days without a day Sabbath, and it's our choice to participate in it or not. Anything else?
Sabbath is here.
Yeah,
Or we participate in it.
right. Right. What, no other comments? We will dismiss to Youth Sunday. So, thank you all.